Our speaker tonight is Professor Nicholas Terpstra, and as our marketing material states, he is a historian of the Renaissance and early modern social history, exploring questions at the intersection of politics, religion, gender, and charity, above all those that deal with marginalized individuals and groups. He has published 5 monographs, 5 single-authored monographs, a number of edited collections, a collection of sources, and numerous articles. And many of his works touch on subjects with a modern resonance. For instance, his 2015 book, Religious Refugees in the Early Modern World, An Alternative History of the Reformation, discusses Christians, Jews, and Muslims forced to flee their countries because of religious beliefs, something, of course, we are already also seeing in the modern world. Another book studies women, politics, and the reform of poor relief in Renaissance Italy. And you can think about poverty and so forth in today's society. Now, as interest in groups such as religious minorities or women is fairly common these days, that another interest in children and young people is somewhat rarer for scholars. But he has written 2 books on children, Abandoned Children of the Italian Renaissance, Orphan Care in Florence and Bologna, and Lost Girls, Sex and Death in Renaissance Florence. Great title. Today, he is perhaps moving up in years a bit, so to speak, by speaking on the topic, On the Move, Finding Young People in the Early Modern World. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nicholas Terpstra.
Thanks very much, Professor Thomas, for that kind introduction. And it's a great honor to be able to give the Edith Bleich lecture tonight. So I'd like to thank you all as well for coming out on a warm evening to hear me go on about young people. I'd also like to thank those at the Center for Humanities who've made this a wonderful visit thus far. Certainly Hugh Thomas, the director, Christina Larson, the assistant director, and Arnie Dunham, the coordinator. So, let's see. Where do we find youths in the early modern world? Where did they find themselves? Often it was on the road or on the seas, in motion from home to some other place or places, and seldom entirely by choice. As we become more curious about global history and to seeing how Europeans of the 15th to 18th centuries encountered the world and were shaped by it, we're drawn to the intersections of this mobility with gender and race. Much of what was new in the early modern experience came first to and through young people, often as the involuntary agents of broader social and economic forces. Today I'll focus first on a few individuals or groups of young people from different parts of the world who demonstrate some of these realities. I'll then pull back and consider why looking more closely at these youths might reshape our understanding of the early modern period more generally. So we start with Thomas Platter. By age 10 or 11, Thomas Platter, who is this one, had been abandoned by his widowed mother and was herding goats on a remote Swiss hillside. He was passed down through the extended family to an elderly priest who attempted to beat an education into him before throwing him out the door with a gold coin and directions north to Germany. Through his teens and 20s, Thomas roamed across Central Europe, picking up work, joining gangs, developing practical skills, and getting an education. Taking a room in a Basel brothel to study with fewer distractions, which is a bit strange, and eating raw turnips and sand to keep himself awake, Thomas studied the classics by night and picked up the printing trade by day. He was the printer of the first edition of John Calvin's Institutes of Christian Religion, and he moved steadily up the social ladder. He sent his son Felix, the one in the middle, at age 14 to medical school in Montpellier in the south of France. After a university career marked by charivaries, sword fights, and secret nighttime autopsies with stolen bodies, Felix returned to Basel, where a series of plagues that took the lives of older doctors allowed him to rise quickly up the ranks and become the city's chief physician by age 34. The plagues would also take most of Felix's siblings, but spare his own son Thomas, who followed his father's path to Montpellier and medicine. And that's that one there. And to prosperity. In 3 generations, the Platter males rose from abandoned goatherd to bourgeois professional. In her teens, Glucko Lieb was leaving Hamburg to marry a young gold merchant who lived 200 kilometers south. Betrothed 2 years earlier at age 12, Glucko was the daughter of a wealthy Hamburg diamond trader. The Jewish family had been expelled from Hamburg in 1649 when Glucko was 3. Glucko received minimal formal schooling, but learned a lot from her parents about the international gem trade. She would join her husband in business and become a highly accomplished pearl trader. She had many children before being widowed twice. Like Thomas Platter, she wrote a memoir for her children. It's the only early modern woman's memoir written in Yiddish. Travels, both voluntary and forced, also marked the early years of Al-Hasan ibn Muhammad al-Wazan al-Fazi, a Muslim aristocrat and Catholic convert. Born in Granada shortly after the Spanish conquest to a Muslim father and a mother who may have been a Jewish convert to Islam, Al-Hasan al-Wazan and his family were expelled to North Africa in the early 1500s. An influential uncle arranged a university education and a place in court and took him on diplomatic missions to Timbuktu. On a mission to Istanbul, Al-Hasan al-Wazan was seized by Catholic pirates and brought as a prize to Rome. In 1520, he converted to Catholicism and rose in the papal court as an author and a translator. Here he wrote The Description of Africa, a widely translated work that would earn him the nickname Leo Africanus. Al-Hasan al-Wazan disappeared into the pseudonym. And in fact, he disappeared before The Description of Africa was even published. Troops of the Holy Roman Emperor seized and sacked Rome in 1527, and Al-Hasan al-Wazan disappeared into the chaos, most likely returning to North Africa. In February 1582, 4 Japanese youths sailed out of Nagasaki, headed for Europe. Ito Mancho Sukamasu, Chiiwa Michael Sesamo, Hara Martin, and Nakura Julian made up a quasi-diplomatic mission, the Tensho Embassy, to link Japan's fledgling Christian community with Catholic powers in Europe. They were all 14 or 15, had been raised as Christians, and spoke Portuguese, Spanish, and Latin. This was at the height of the Catholic mission, when there may have been as many as 130,000 Catholics converts in Japan. Landing in Lisbon in August 1584, the 4 boys spent the next 20 months traveling through Portugal, Spain, and Italy, meeting nobles and churchmen, appearing in Japanese dress in processions in Rome and Venice, and being celebrated by Pope Gregory XIII as signs of Catholicism's global scope. They returned to Japan in 1590 with maps, books, a printing press, and musical instruments on which they played European music for the Japanese emperor. The 4 joined the Jesuit order a year after their return to Japan, but they were caught between 2 worlds. Having traveled Europe in Japanese dress, as examples of Catholic universality, they now traveled Japan in European clothes as signs of Christian exceptionality. 2 died in Nagasaki, 1 fled to Macau, 1 seems to have abandoned Christianity. Angelique was born into slavery in 18th century Madeira and was brought by a Flemish trader to New England before a Montreal businessman purchased her as a domestic servant. She joined a household dependent on the forced labor of young people, including enslaved Africans and indigenous youth, and indentured servants. She was treated as a possession, and the businessman may have allowed or even arranged her sexual relations with a friend's enslaved African, which resulted in her bearing 3 children in 2 years. None lived more than 5 months. The businessman died the following year, and when his widow signaled her intention to sell Angelique, she escaped with an indentured white man. Captured shortly thereafter, Angelique was returned to her mistress. A month later, a fire broke out in the home and consumed the entire neighborhood. Angelique was widely suspected of having set the fire to cover a second escape. She was arrested, charged, tried, but through 6 weeks of trial, there was no evidence to convict her until a 5-year-old girl testified to having seen her bring live coals to the attic of the house. Within a few days, Angelique was tortured, hanged, and burned, her ashes scattered to the wind. A parallel fate could have overtaken young Ayuba Suleiman Dairo from a leading Muslim family in Fouta in modern-day Senegal. While traveling to sell enslaved peoples to British traders, he was himself seized and shipped from Gambia to Maryland, where he was put to work on a tobacco plantation. His manner, bearing an obvious learning, convinced many that he was different, but did not prevent him from being imprisoned when he fled the tobacco plantation. Ayuba Suleiman came to the attention of a small group in Boston who were determined to help him. They arranged for schooling, but still treated him as property, seeking compensation before they would free him. After 3 years in America, he was transferred to England and feted as an exotic prize, much as Al-Hassan al-Wazan had been in Italy 2 centuries earlier. He was hosted at dinners, at country house weekends, while funds were being raised for his release, about $20,000 in modern US funds. After release, Ayuba Suleiman returned to Africa, where he spent the remainder of his life working for the Royal Africa Company, which managed a good part of the Atlantic slave trade under a crown charter. In contemporary Manila, Cecilia Salazar, for whom I don't have an image, I'm sorry, born to a Spanish official and indigenous mother, was sent as a young girl to an enclosure called a beaterio in the capital. And it was in the area of Manila called the Intramuros. So the stone-walled Spanish compound, which was on the coast. Considered illegitimate, young women like Cecilia fell between 2 worlds, available as spouses to Spanish immigrants, but otherwise lacking a place in either Spanish or indigenous society. Cecilia entered the beaterio as a young girl, and with no husband to facilitate her exit, she professed as a nun 10 years later. Yet from the beaterio's windows, she managed to strike up a relationship with another colonial official, and she asked to leave in order to marry her lover. When the beaterio refused, Cecilia took her case to the archbishop, arguing that she had professed under coercion and was mistreated in the home. Her sisters in the home countered that she was rude and restless and broke the rules repeatedly, and she brought her lover into the convent. Cecilia was eventually released from her vows. She married her lover and crossed the Pacific to Mexico, where both disappeared from the records. There are many different ways to move towards a global history of early modern youth. Recent work has shown how they played and fought, why they occupied certain streets at certain times, how they ruled the night with noises, costumes, and sometimes with violence, when they flexed their bodies, deployed sound as an instrument, or experienced emotions, how they gradually ceased to be young. Without homogenizing the varieties of youth experience around the globe from the 15th into the 18th centuries, we find recurrences, parallels, and shared experiences that bear the marks of common biological realities, patriarchal gender norms, and social pressures. This gives us some of the pieces of a global history, but much of it would be true of youths in any period. Was there anything particular to the early modern era that might focus our comparisons. Mobility moves us further towards that goal. Historians like Sanjay Subramaniam, Kapil Raj, Tamar Herzog, Julia McClure, and Lucy Underwood have posited the mobility of people and ideas as key to early modern global connections and entanglements in commerce, ideology, religion, and medical care. Thomas Plater, Glucker Lieb, Al-Hassan al-Wazan, Cecilia Saladar, and the others noted above all traveled far as youths, sometimes voluntarily, often not. They were each unmarried when traveling, and so by one of the most common definitions of the period, they were youths regardless of their age. Yet some were hardly young in chronological terms. Others were so bound by social and legal constraints that questions of marriage, adulthood, and agency are moot. Yet all of them moved. The forces that moved them in their youth, from hunger or enslavement to ambition, marriage, or escape, defined life paths that sometimes ended well and sometimes not. When we use concepts like liminality and define youths relationally in terms of roles that move them towards adulthood, we project a narrative structure onto their lives. Yet with mobility, the last chapter in that narrative may be unwritten. We don't know how the story ends, since the individuals move right out of the historical record. That ambiguity may be central to a global history of early modern youth. We can still use these particular youths and their mobility to sketch the global history of youth, since it was some of the most important, new, and distinct economic, diplomatic, religious, and social movements of the early modern period that put them on the road. The mobility that directed these youths was defining new patterns on the early modern globe. Moreover, their experience was rendering inadequate the common relational definition of youth as lying in some indistinct zone between the start of sexual maturity and marriage. Now, a long historiographical tradition has identified the Renaissance in Europe as a period of growing individuality and personal autonomy. It seized on individuals like Plater and Gluckel as inspiring examples of achievement and social mobility. When Thomas Plater moved from being an abandoned goat-herding child and a wandering beggar to a self-taught humanist teacher and publisher, he demonstrated how young Europeans could shatter class restrictions, make a mark, start a bourgeois dynasty. When Gluckel of Hamelin took the business acumen she learned as a girl in Hamburg and developed a continent-wide seed pearl business in a small town, while giving birth to over a dozen children, she demonstrated that limits of race, religion, and gender were no match for the human spirit and determination. For historians who saw the Renaissance sunny side up, the birth of a modern liberal order, young capitalists like Thomas and Gluckel demonstrated the social and economic mobility that expressed the youthful energy and optimistic promise of European modernity as it empowered individuals to move beyond social restrictions. Historians are now demonstrating how much of this European social mobility and expanding capitalist prosperity was predicated on the forced labor of others. The beginning of our period marks the time when the Portuguese began enslaving large numbers of black Africans and bringing them into Europe. Some were prized as exotics and artists who in small numbers could be domestic servants or teach dancing or fencing. Many more were transported as laborers to the cork, sugar, and grain plantations that the Portuguese were developing on the continent and on the Atlantic islands that they had seized, above all the Madeiras and the Azores. The economic tools and techniques for objectifying humans in this way were provided by merchants and capitalists from Genoa, which had itself been a critical hub of the Mediterranean slave trade for over a century. Where the Mediterranean slave trade has been as much about ransom as about labor, the Atlantic slave trade was built on labor alone, and that meant investors aimed to own the means of production. Mediterranean slaves were encouraged by their captors to find ways of ransoming themselves and returning home, an impossibility for the Africans imprisoned in the Atlantic chattel slave trade. What does this have to do with the history of youth? The majority of those enslaved and transported in and to the Americas were youths. This included both Africans captured and forced overseas and indigenous peoples enslaved by European conquerors. The historian Alpha Cooper has estimated that in New France, the average age of enslaved Africans was 17, and of enslaved indigenous peoples, 25. Working conditions across the Americas were such that the enslaved survived only for an average of 8 years. Even allowing for local statistical variations, the slave economy was built on youths. These calculations were built into the legal contracts and financial instruments that organized slave labor and that made it such a profitable element of Europe's expanding capitalist global order. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database estimates that just under 1 million Africans were enslaved and transported to the Americas from 1501 to 1650. 945,000 embarked and 727,000 disembarked, meaning that over 23% died on the voyage. Looking more closely, the death rate on 16th century voyages reached almost 30%, falling to 20% as the number of ships and enslaved increased in the early 17th century. Children comprised 21.8% of those who survived, and adult males 56.8%. Yet, since those keeping the statistics calculated adulthood as starting at age 13 or 14, we can safely assume that the majority of those enslaved were what we would consider children, adolescents, and youths. The numbers in the Atlantic slave trade would grow rapidly over the coming centuries, with an estimated total of 12.5 million taken from Africa and 10.7 million arriving in 36,000 voyages to 1866. So a mortality averaged out of 14.52% on these voyages over the 4 centuries. Our period, the early modern period, marks the transition from one form of slavery to another. Al-Hassan al-Razan redeemed himself from Mediterranean slavery by converting to Catholicism and eventually escaping back to North Africa. 2 centuries later, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo was able to redeem himself by working with the patrons who raised funds to recoup the investment of the men who had purchased and traded him and returned to West Africa. But they were the exceptions. Angelique, born into slavery in the Portuguese Madeiras, shipped to New England by a Flemish trader, sold to a Montreal merchant who may have included forced intercourse among his work obligations, and eventually hanged and burned by French colonial authorities, all before reaching age 30. Angelique was closer to the rule. Intersections of race, gender, and procreation run through the colonialist enterprise. The cases and statistics quoted above show that youths were affected more than any other social group. The slave trade was part of this. But there were other forms of controlling and strategically mobilizing youths. Indenturing brought many Europeans to the colonies as sailors, soldiers, and laborers. Of the approximately 500,000 Europeans who emigrated to British America over the colonial period, roughly 55,000 were prisoners, and 215,000 were indentured laborers. And 75% of all of these were under age 25. Youths or their guardians signed contracts pledging to work for a fixed period of time before being released. Food, shelter, and clothing were part of the contract. But for those who were indentured, the motivating compensation came at the end of the term: money, goods, land, or some reward. Europeans drew on existing practices like apprenticeship when they framed indentures. Unlike apprentices, indentured youths received little, if any, artisanal training. What they gained at the end of their contract was adulthood, with the freedom and possibly even an obligation to marry and establish a household. If the narrative of their lives followed the usual cultural pattern, their passage over the threshold or the limit gave them a greater stake in colonial society as householders. It also gave them a greater motivation to exaggerate those markers, like race, which distinguished them from other forced laborers. Global mobility complicated the life narrative for many early modern youths. The desire of colonizing powers to draw more of their white populations to settle overseas compromised some traditional legal and social restraints, so that it proved harder to control white settlers in colonial settings. Young males drove the colonial enterprise. Young women like Cecilia Salazar in Manila were their offspring and were often abandoned as their white fathers moved on. The children born from sexual encounters between indigenous and enslaved women and Spanish officials, English sailors, French soldiers, or the countless young factors sent out by monopoly trading companies became a social challenge for colonial officials. In many ports and outposts, foundling homes and orphanages were the first charitable institutions that authorities established. It's no coincidence that exclusionary, racializing ideologies were increasing at precisely this time in Europe, and that barriers of blood and color were hardening in metropoles like London, Madrid, Paris, and Amsterdam. Racism expanded in this context. Faced with a demographic reckoning of their own making in the colonies, Europeans responded by shoring up the ideological boundaries at home. They also firmed up the architectural boundaries overseas with a complex series of walled enclosures and enclaves. It was far easier to enclose somebody like Cecilia Salazar than to acknowledge that racial purity was an artificial construct legitimizing economic exploitation. Enclosure rendered her invisible. In the eyes of colonial officials, the added benefit of an enclosure like Cecilia's Beaterio in Manila was that it could shelter mixed-race women that white Spanish settlers might want to marry. Marriage would eventually provide Cecilia with her ticket out of the Beaterio. Her migration with her new husband from the Philippines to Mexico was, in the eyes of Spanish officials, an entirely satisfactory outcome, both legally and demographically. So the great majority of youths who traversed the early modern globe did so under duress. They were enslaved, indentured, press-ganged, or imprisoned. Some traveled widely, others on one-way trips. And this merging of forced mobility and forced labor on a mass scale is a distinctly early modern development. It accelerates with the slave trade in the 15th century and carries on into the 19th century. The Portuguese and Spanish would dominate the Atlantic trade, depopulating West Africa as they moved millions to Brazil and the Caribbean. From 1500 to 1650, 75% of those they enslaved would be sent to mainland plantations. The British would come to exercise a greater variety of forms, arguably move the greatest number of people, through their global empire. This included the enslavement of Africans, colonial convict transportation, and the movement of 2 million indentured South Asian laborers to Africa and the Caribbean after the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act. So I think that if we want to frame a global history of early modern youth predicated on mobility, we need to start with the varieties of forced labor. The opportunities and necessities of an emerging global and colonial capitalism put these youths in motion and triggered unforeseen consequences. Youths were disproportionately the agents, realizing capitalism and colonialism on the ground as traders, soldiers, planters, trappers, sailors. This was the economic system that Ayuba Suleiman Diallo worked within before his own period of enslavement and then after his period of enslavement. Of course, many more youths in Europe traveled only short distances within local or regional circuits, from farms to nearby towns or from one neighborhood to another within a city. Most journeymen never traveled more than 25 kilometers from home. Gathering their experiences allows us to compare practices across early modern spaces and cultures. Yet those comparisons will show us less about what is distinct about early modern global mobility and contact. Grim as it may sound, the first element in a global history of early modern youth is the objectification and exploitation of people and their labor, ranging from chattel slavery at the most extreme to various forms of indentured servitude and enclosures with forced labor. Yet there were other youths who did not travel under force or duress. The ones furthest from compulsion were diplomats or administrators. Comparing their experiences shows us a very different experience of global mobility as we move between the extremes of enslavement and entitlement. New forms of labor required new forms of management, and youths were central actors in both. While various forms of forced labor were transforming youth engagement in the global economy at the foundational level, the development of a professional class whose training was also mobile was transforming the middle and upper class. Traveling in regional or international circuits for professional training and formation was an expectation for European youths from more financially stable backgrounds. It included students moving for a university education in law or medicine, or journeymen on their Wanderjahr. Even as North European Protestant cities and states established new universities to avoid sending their youths to ancient Catholic institutions in Italy and France, familiar patterns of international travel remained. Thomas Plater may have published Calvin's Institutes and become a prominent burgher in one of the leading Swiss Protestant cities of Basel, but he still sent his son Felix to Montpellier in Catholic France for medical training at age 15. Felix quickly learned to navigate the complex rules of cross-cultural survival, including how to fry eggs secretly over a candle during Lent. You do it by using vellum or parchment. His degree from an internationally renowned medical school aided Felix's rapid professional investment on his return to Basel. And a few decades later, as I said, he would send his own son Thomas to his alma mater, even as the recent civil wars of religion in France were smoldering, with Montpellier as one of the tense spots. The travels of these three generations of Plater youths in the early, mid, and later 16th century followed traditional patterns of individuals using university education to gain professional credentials and rise up the social ladder. Precedents for both the kind and scale of their travel could easily be found elsewhere. Al-Hassan al-Wazan's travels as a young diplomat to Ottoman Istanbul, Mamluk Cairo, and Safavid Baghdad would allow him to gain skills and weave a network for his later professional success. And the 4 Japanese youths of the Tensho Embassy were meant to develop their skills as cultural interpreters, even if the adults sending them may have had mixed ideas of what it was they were interpreting and to who. One factor that brought differences of kind and scale into early modern mobility was the religious schism known as the Reformation. Some of the key events were led by youths impatient with the structures and theologies of the institutional Catholic Church. Martin Luther was in his mid-20s when he began questioning that structure and theology. John Calvin was roughly the same age when he was implicated in a religious upheaval in Paris that forced him to flee across the border. Conrad Grebel and Menno Simons began framing their religious radicalism at roughly the same age. Public disputes were critical theaters for the performance of Reformation at the time. And so, just by the way, this is Conrad Grebel. This is Luther and some of his students burning the bull, the papal bull. This is Luther himself as a young person. These are early Mennonite martyrs. And this is Rose Allens, who is a serving girl who was being tortured by English Catholic officials. While Luther lost a public dispute held with Catholic theologians in the university town of Heidelberg in 1518, he galvanized a host of university students and brought them over to his cause. University students burned the papal bull that excommunicated Luther, and that's what they're doing up there. And then they went on to burn much else besides. Youths in their 20s triggered the Reformation and drove the actions that had some of their elders fearing that the anarchy of the apocalypse had descended on Europe. It would be middle-aged theologians and politicians who channeled change back into more familiar institutional forms. The determination of reforming youths to overturn existing religious ideas and structures often forced them to flee for short periods, like Luther, or for life, like Calvin and Menno Simons. Or it cut those lives short, as with Conrad Grebel, who died shortly after escaping prison at age 28. the officials in Zurich did not want to kill him, but he repeatedly went back to violating the rules. And so even though they tried to say, here's the key, just get out of here, just get out of town, he wanted to make an issue out of it, and since he wanted to make a martyr of himself. Now, Reformation had a global dimension tied directly to the articulation of national identities among the European states that led the colonialist push into Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Religious institutions were becoming more intensely national and political, just as European states were expanding globally. High-profile converts were never just souls saved, but valuable talismans in religio-political competitions, as the case of Al-Hassan al-Wazan, the Japanese Tensho embassy, and Ayuba Suleiman Diallo all demonstrated. Yet not all would convert. Reform often entailed greater discipline and exclusion of those who deviated from the religious mainstream. This affected the Jews first, and accelerating expulsions dislocated Jews from European communities in the 15th and 16th centuries, and continued well past the 17th. Gluckel's early form of flight as a child refugee from Hamburg was a too common form of mobility within the early modern Jewish diaspora, driven and shaped by Europe's structural and episodic racism. Moreover, that religiously refracted racism forced the expectation of mobility on early modern Jewish communities. Gluckel's move to Hamelin as a 14-year-old bride and her travels further across Europe for trade were part of a diasporic dispersal forced on Jews, by Christian exclusion rather than by professional aspirations alone. The experience of Jews would extend to Iberian Muslims in the 16th and 17th centuries, forcing many to North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. And Europe's Christians did not spare each other. The early modern period was when religious refugees became a mass phenomenon. Within Christendom, Catholic and Protestant reforms forced some to flee, led others to seek their future in places with fewer restrictions. Religious movements coming out of the Reformation used youths as symbols, as missionaries, and as agents in the building of new and holy social orders. All of this required travel for formal schooling, for practical training, for implementation. Who moved, from where, to where, for what, and what can these movements weave into a global history of youth? Here again, a couple of examples demonstrate how questions of intent, authority, and agency intertwined. The Tensho embassy of Japanese youths to Europe, to Mediterranean Europe, highlights these interconnections. These 4 youths, again, age 14, 15 when they start out, they were not diplomats in any formal sense, with responsibility for negotiating treaties or trade concessions, nor were they missionaries. They were actors in a far larger drama about global economic, religious, and cultural competition and exchange. And in this instance, the drama left them as actors with little agency. Their mission from Japan to Rome was largely symbolic. He was critical that it involved Japanese Catholic youths, and that it be widely advertised across Europe, especially in Protestant polities. Early modern Catholicism claimed that its very universality was one of the key proofs of its superiority over upstart Protestant churches with their largely local followings. Yet the 4 returned not to triumph, but to ambiguity. Jesuit hesitancy about ordaining those who were not European, combined with Tokugawa shogunate's heightened campaign against all but Japanese religious traditions, meant that they were stranded in between with little opportunity to make an impact. Other youth missions had greater impact, and sometimes local and global realities could give youths greater agency, even if it also increased the immediate threats to them. In 1539, King Afonso I of Congo wrote to his counterpart, King John III of Portugal, seeking safe conduct for a group of 6 noble youths whom he was sending to Lisbon and then on to Rome for training as priests. King Afonso had reason to seek this protection, since a far larger group of 20 youths that he had sent to Portugal 13 years earlier in 1526 had essentially been lost, and some of them possibly enslaved. Afonso was building an indigenous Catholic church in Congo that drew on European resources and expertise without being indebted to European clergy. He created an educational network that trained local noble youths in Christian religious concepts in schools in Congo, Lisbon, and Rome, and then sent them across the country. Afonso I intended to construct Congo's Catholic establishment on local social structures, as was the case in Europe, and he relied on youths to do the building. The Pope had appointed his son Henrique as Bishop of Utica, and the Congolese youths that Afonso was sending to Portugal and Rome for seminary training were likely from among the 12 matrilineal descent groups, or kanda, that comprised the Wisi-Congo aristocracy. The Catholicism developed by these Wisi-Congo youths incorporated forms of African religion. They were articulated in the Kikongo Catechism of the 1550s and disseminated via the far-reaching educational system that was built by Afonso I. Jesuit missionaries became more influential during the Portuguese conquest of Angola to the south later in the 16th century. While initially aiming to institute a form of Catholicism free of syncretism or hybrid elements, by the 1620s they had developed a Kimbundu Catechism, which adapted local forms. Both the Kikongo Catechism and the Kimbundu Catechisms incorporated elements of indigenous spirituality, which also influenced Catholicism in the Americas. Some enslaved Africans brought these catechisms and catechists with them, and Jesuit missionaries used both the Kikongo and Kimbundu catechisms in their transatlantic mission work, importing West African elements into Brazilian Catholicism. As we trace the origins and spread of these catechisms, developed and disseminated in a Catholic Church with state sanction and an indigenous hierarchy, we see a very different outcome from what we saw in Japan. Congolese youths, like those that Afonso I sent to Rome, were critical to the broader intersections of mobility, education, missions, and print that were creating and disseminating a distinctly early modern global religion that really then spreads on both sides of the Atlantic. Catholic religious orders sent thousands of missionaries, young men and women, to the Americas, Asia, and Africa from the early 16th century. While a smaller number of indigenous or mixed-race Catholic youths moved towards Rome, as the Congolese and Japanese youths did, the institutional structure of the Catholic Church provided one of the few social frameworks for this kind of transnational movement back and forth between Europe and other parts of the world. The need to train clergy, the structures of religious orders, and the powerful draw of Rome as a destination of pilgrimage made a global reciprocal movement of young missionaries far more common within the early modern Catholic Church than within contemporary Protestant churches. Even if Catholicism's status as the first global religion would only be fully realized in the modern era, the key patterns and the first initiatives were distinctly early modern. Early missionaries to the Americas, searching for interpreters and collaborators, distinctly and deliberately recruited both the children of leading indigenous convert families and also mixed-race children of high-born colonial officials. As with the Japanese and Congolese youths, some of these young men traveled to Rome for schooling or on pilgrimage, and the publicity expanded the impact of their visits beyond what the small numbers might suggest. Protestant overseas missions were slower to expand, and the common model of the Protestant clergy as married patriarchs heading the holy household meant that they were more often older and less mobile. Moreover, Protestantism was never as dependent on its clergy as Catholicism, framed as the latter was around a sacramental system that could not operate in the absence of ordained priests. This meant that Protestants were less reliant on recruiting indigenous clergy, though with some notable exceptions. I've suggested that mission or charitable activity most critical to the early modern colonial enterprise was orphanages. They housed the abandoned offspring that young traders, sailors, soldiers abandoned when they died or when they moved on. They also served as a potential source for marriage partners for the young males that authorities were seeking to draw out to the colonies. It was again predominantly young male and female missionaries who established and staffed them. Portuguese and Spanish missionaries and surgeons offered a wide range of services, including medical services and foundling and orphan care through institutions called the Misericordias. They were important vehicles for acculturation, for legitimation, and for demographic expansion. Given the dangers and distances involved, their personnel over the first century were again largely youths, since no adults wanted to go out. So anytime it was time to staff these institutions, they were staffed always with young medical graduates, interns, people like that. The Dutch East India Company recruited the Netherlands Reformed Church to set up orphanages in Cape Town and Batavia. And this was something new. There were no orphanages in the small and often enclosed settlements across medieval Europe where foreign merchants stayed, like London's Steelyard. Setting them up in colonial outposts was a real sign that the Europeans meant to stay. They needed a spiritual rationale that would legitimate their seizure of lands and people by adding a moral mission. Much of this work would fall to young people, as the ones least established, most in need of professional experience, and most mobile. Women and men alike did this charitable mission work. The Italian orphan Angela Merici began the Ursulines as a consorority of young women who wanted to practice active communal charity without being limited by religious enclosure. The French Daughters of Charity followed suit. Their work with schools and hospitals required mobility and inspired others to play an active role in colonial, religious, and charitable care. The Ursuline sister, Marie de l'Incarnation, and the young laywoman, Marguerite Bourgeois, traveled to New France to open shelters for young indigenous, mixed-race, and French women, training them towards vocations or towards lay life as Christian wives and mothers. Bourgeois avoided formal vows and enclosure when she established the Congregation de Notre-Dame de Montréal in 1658. She then took a leading role in a project to bring young French women to the colony to marry young French men already there. From 1663 to 73, so one decade, the French government and the French East India Company sent over 800 poor and largely orphaned young women to New France and subsidized their dowries. Bourgeois housed these young women and helped them find spouses. They were colloquially known as the filles de roi, the daughters of the king. And their new families doubled the population of the colony. It was a distinct demographic policy. And the impact of their mobility was extraordinarily long-lasting. 2/3 of the French population of modern-day Quebec is descended from the families they started. 800 women. Until recently, the historiography of early modern youth has been largely Eurocentric. At the same time, histories that have aimed to put early modern Europe into a global context have not paid much attention to questions of age and the role of youths in particular. We need to bring these two academic conversations together. That expanded conversation can probe the continuities between the European travels of marginalized peoples like Thomas Plater and Gluck of Hamelin, the enslavement and narrow escapes of Al-Hassan al-Wazan and Ayuba Suleiman Dailo, the interplay of ritual, construction, and international competition in the lengthy transnational travels of Japanese and Congolese youths, and of the efforts of Cecilia Salazar and Angelique to escape enclosure and erasure. Mobility defined them all, shaping their prospects, their lives, and their fates. And these were distinctly early modern mobilities. It was a trafficking of youths' minds and bodies for economic, diplomatic, religious, or demographic advantage in contexts that were new to the early modern period. Focusing on enslavement and indenture may not capture the experience of the majority of global youth, but it does underscore the early modern origins of a phenomenon that would transform the globe. And as such, I would argue that it's a much more significant sign of trajectories and impacts than statistics about the number of youths in schools, armies, or poorhouses. Europe was at this point a new and a very junior partner in global dynamics, which were expanding along well-established routes across Asia and the Indian Ocean. Yet the multiplying connections and entanglements across this world that would fundamentally shape the modern era began in this period, and yous were the most active agents shaping that exchange. Thanks very much.
Yes, I thought that your concept of mobility, it's wonderful to define, or to characterize this moment of early modernity when the globe or the planet, in a way, comes together. I mean, it's a planetary moment, very clearly felt, at least in Europe. Okay, because your concept of mobility has centered in Europe. So I would like to know, perhaps, or it would be interesting for future studies to see how that mobility was working in China, for instance. I mean, how is it that it was working at that moment? I mean, how is it that it was working in other areas which were not necessarily Atlantic, European, in order to get exactly what's the planetary field of movement and of mobility? Because, certainly, I mean, in the Atlantic area, I mean, it's going to be very specific because of the whole, I mean, the enormous sort of movement back and forth. But how does that mobility work in other places which were not really centered in Europe and its Atlantic new movements? I think that would be interesting to be able to get the feeling of it all.
Yeah. Well, and admittedly, so I'm a European historian, so when I'm talking about global, it's in a sense Europe's global expansion still, but then trying to see that more as a reciprocal process. But I mean, one example would be in again, I was showing Manila. When you think of Manila, then so from 1570s, the Spanish in a sense occupy that area, take it over, and establish themselves there. But what we should remember is that even, say by 1620s, within that area that was the Intramuros, there's maybe 2,400 Spanish. Outside there were 20,000 Chinese, there were 8,000 Japanese, and there were about 20,000 Tagalog along the coast. So when you speak of Manila as a Spanish outpost, maybe not, right? And because those others, what's happening there too is that what they've done is they've established a place that young people from other places are going. I can't say that the Chinese and the Japanese traders who are meeting in Manila are as young. They may be, but I'm not really sure. But they come there in part because that also then is a place where they can trade with each other. So not everybody comes to trade with the Spanish. They come to trade with each other, right? And so what you get with these global trading nodes, across the Indian Ocean. And then, because then there's also the fleet, the annual fleet that goes between Manila and Acapulco. On that fleet, you get Chinese and Japanese traders moving to Mexico. So there is, and I'm not trying to say it's a large number, but what I was trying to say is that this is something that hasn't existed before. It's distinctly early modern. So even if it's a smaller number, it seems to me it is something that singles out this period when you are going to have more movements of more peoples in different directions because of the networks that are created. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the interesting talk. I had a question related to something that you mentioned early on, which was marriage as being a marker of when someone went from being youth to being adult, I guess.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what are some other ways in which you can, or people at the time, distinguished between youth and adult, given the radically different lifespans in this period than in our own. I'm just curious what some of those markers would have been. If in terms of how they thought about them at the time, because we can obviously project more or less what we consider young, and I guess that would vary. I mean, when I was the age of, I thought 30 was old, but obviously not anymore.
It is.
So I was wondering if maybe you could get us into the mind of how maybe people at the time would have thought of this.
It's funny because a lot of it comes with increasing legal responsibilities, including things like possessions and the rest. But so much of that still gets predicated on marriage, right? So it's hard in different contexts to move away from that, unless you've got say with clergy, in which case possibly ordination becomes the equivalent of marriage. Now, having said that, there's a large number of people and a larger group than we think who never marry, including a large number of women in European cities. And some historians have estimated that in some time periods it could be as much as 25%. So they would be considered older, possibly adult by the time they're into their 20s. But the key thing is, do they have the legal rights that allow them to, in a sense, exercise the agency of an adult? And sometimes they don't. Right, because they may have the age, they may to some extent have the recognition, but they don't necessarily have the legal status, and so they're in this kind of this liminal zone until they move, say, into their 30s or 40s. Assuming that we're still talking about people who aren't married, but then they're also not always part of society in quite the same way. So society still kind of moves people into marriage, into household, into procreation, and has some ways of kind of accommodating people within that, but not as much finding a real social role for them. So they're a reality, they exist. I mean, they're a demographic reality, but you don't find that they are given, say, roles within guilds. They're not given roles, say, within social groups. They're in this kind of fluid in-between stage. Now, if they're at the very bottom of the social scale, if they're very poor, then that, in a sense, they're probably not going to have those social roles anyway. But I think at that point, then you're looking at things like work identity, which become important. And if you're part of a community of people who are working, you're part of a community of people who recognize you. So European society is trying to find ways that don't necessarily change its legal structure, but it's always, in a sense, an adaptation. So there's ways that they can recognize, but like I say, it's an adaptation. It's not really a recognized state. The way, say, what we have now. There's certain ages. At a certain age, you get a driver's license. At a certain age, you can vote. At a certain age, you can drink alcohol. Those kinds of things. They don't have those structures at that time. They have all sorts of visualizations of different ages of humanity, but they really do assume still, for purposes of definition and rights, they really do assume that kind of movement into marriage.
One question over here.
Sure.
You made it very clear the difference between the movement of, let's say, slaves towards Europe or towards other part of the world. And towards Europe, that they had the path to liberty, to freedom. Now, my question is, do you see any type of similarity between what you described in the Renaissance period to what happened with the Roman Empire, which is the establishment of a power in Rome, the establishment and regulation of traffic and commerce in the Mediterranean, and the movement of people in order to get work, labor, and to get control of territories conquered by the Roman Empire. Thank you.
Yeah, in the sense of mobility, so do I see a parallel in the mobility of the early modern and the Roman period? Yeah, absolutely, I would. And I think that part of it is there's a zone there of trade, economy, and military movement, which establishes it within that area of the Mediterranean zone. I think what distinguishes what's going on in the early modern period is you blow it up beyond the Mediterranean. It goes far beyond the Mediterranean, right? But I think there's some of the same vectors, right? It's vectors of trade, military expansion, I think one other thing that does become different in the early modern period is when I mentioned about the Reformation, religion and missions as a key vector also for movement of people and transit. But I do think that they're quite similar. And what's interesting is that, we were talking about the revival of Roman law and the ways that Roman law is revived. Different European nations revived different types of Roman law for different types of enslavement and different types of slave settlement. And so the way that the Dutch revived Roman law for their treatment of slaves is different from the way the French do. And while the English are not thought to be reviving Roman law, they're using Roman law in the slave setting. So that's that to me is actually also then to continue with what you're talking about with revivals of Roman law. I define the Renaissance as revival of Roman examples, and we often again think of the Renaissance as revival of positive Roman examples. But the Romans provide a whole range of negative examples, or at least examples that lead to various forms of enslavement or suppression, and law is one of them. And they're very deliberately revived in particular ways by those different cultures.
All right, one more question. All right. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Well, thank you. I just have, I'd like you to perhaps just touch briefly on on different kinds of transportation that happened at the time, especially the kind of development of transportation. It's almost kind of like the chicken or the egg, which came first. Because I was thinking when you were speaking about the transoceanic travel, they wouldn't have been able to do it unless they had galleys. And so, so the building of the galley was extremely important. And you can say on Earth, on land, you could say the same about carriages. The ways that carriages were developed as well that were very different. So I just wondered if you had any ideas about the kind of technology of the time for travel.
If I'm going to be honest, I'd say no. If I'm going to prevaricate, I'd say yes, absolutely. By which I mean to say, no, I think you're absolutely right. That like so much of this time period, one of the reasons why it happens throughout here is because of the way technology comes together. In the same way that printing, right? Printing expands in this time period, but it's a kind of an opportune coming together of different technologies. And I think that certainly if we see the kind of transits and the centrality of Europeans in some of these transits, it has to do as well with the ships that they had. And when you get particularly a lot of the movements around, I think particularly the Indian Ocean and in South Asia, a lot of that is conducted by the Portuguese and to some extent by the Dutch without any reference to Portugal or the Netherlands. So like the Portuguese become transshippers within the Indian Ocean, moving things all around the Indian Ocean. They don't bring them back to Lisbon. They're just active there. They're established there. And it's because of this kind of, because of the ships that they have. I think that's the kind of thing that's then going to kind of spread also the example of what I'm talking about. So that colonialism and that capitalist connection to it is not all of the strings go back to Europe, but it's Europeans also diffusing in other parts of the world and then sharing technologies and expanding technologies. And again, like so the kind of ships that expand in the Indian Ocean become a hybrid of the kind of ships that you get between what the Portuguese develop and what's already there locally. So yeah, I think technology is always extraordinarily important. I don't know the effect of carriages actually. Every time I see them, I think it'd be a terrible thing to travel in. You'd probably die before you got to the end of it. But yeah, I think technology is extraordinarily important for this.
Okay, well, I'd like everybody to join in another round of applause, please.